Coming up, bridging the gap between Indigenous knowledge and a state-run Nature Conservancy department. We'll meet the Native woman who plans to do just that in Montana. Plus, from the Met Gala in New York to the red carpet at the Emmys in Los Angeles, Natives are in the spotlight. We'll take a closer look at them. I'm Patty Thalohungva. Join us for those interviews, plus headlines from Indian Country today.
The Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communication at Arizona State University is a proud supporter of Indian Country Today. Students at Cronkite News and Gaylord College at the University of Oklahoma cover Indigenous communities together. This important work is distributed by more than 100 news organizations. This collaboration provides a much-needed boost to coverage of Native American communities nationwide. Learn more at cronkitenews.azpbs.org.
This is Indian Country Today.
Esquili, yes, thank you for joining us. I'm Patty Thalohungva. Minnesota regulators are ordering Enbridge to pay more than $3 million for allegedly violating state environmental law. The State Department of Natural Resources says Enbridge dug too deeply into the ground and pierced an artesian aquifer that caused 24 million gallons of groundwater to leak out. This happened during construction of the Line 3 oil pipeline, and the DNR says it's a clear violation of state law. The department is ordering Enbridge to put more than $2 million into escrow for restoration and damage to nearby wetlands. They must also pay $300,000 to mitigate the loss of groundwater and $250,000 for long-term monitoring of the wetlands. The Rosebud Economic Development Corporation in South Dakota is announcing a 3-year pilot program to revitalize the Lakota language. The new program is aimed at reducing barriers for citizens of the Rosebud Sioux tribe to learn and pass on the language to future generations. And the funding for this initiative comes from an anonymous partner. Many fluent speakers have been lost to COVID-19, leaving 2,000, so bold action is required.
The idea behind the program is that we will pay 7 individuals a full-time salary for 3 years to learn the Lakota language and to achieve conversational fluency.
Along with fluent speakers, the Development Corporation is going to hire a project manager who will shape and oversee the initiative. The program will begin accepting applications in the coming months. In Peru, the Quechua language is continuing to survive despite centuries of laws and discrimination that discouraged its use. In many rural villages in the Peruvian Andes, the indigenous language is the only one used by older generations. But efforts to revive and promote the language hit the spotlight last month. Peru's newly appointed Prime Minister, Guido Bellido, surprised the nation by delivering a speech in Quechua to Congress for the first time in Peru's history. The Prime Minister spoke about Quechua's status as a second-class language in the South American country.
Here, all my siblings speak in Quechua, and many times when Congress discusses the main problems of the country in Spanish, many of them are excluded, marginalized, absolutely disappeared because they don't understand.
His speech is raising hopes the government will increase the language funding in villages where children are reluctant to speak the ancient language. The push to include Native Americans in Connecticut's school curriculum is making positive strides. In the past, tribes did not feel their history was given its due by schools whose own state name means land on the long tidal river, an Algonquin word. After many years of lobbying from tribes, a new law aims to change that. Passed this year, the law requires Native American Studies classes with an emphasis on tribes in the region. Mashantucket Pequot Chairman Rodney Butler says pressing the issue for students to learn about Eastern Woodland tribes is important. Recently, new Native History for All requirements have been adopted into law in North Dakota and Oregon. A cave in Missouri containing native artwork from more than 1,000 years ago was sold at auction last week. Leaders from the Osage Nation say their hope was to buy the land to protect and preserve the sacred site. A private bidder agreed to pay $2.2 million for Picture Cave, along with the 43 acres that surround it. According to the auction website, the cave was the site of a sacred ritual and burying of the dead. It also has more than 290 prehistoric symbols used to represent sounds or meanings. The cave contains the largest collection of Indigenous peoples' polychrome paintings in the state. In a statement, the Osage Nation called the sale heartbreaking. Tesla is sidestepping car dealership laws by setting up shop in Native American territory for the first time. Last week, in partnership with Nambe Pueblo, the electric car maker opened its first facility in New Mexico. State laws prohibit car makers from selling directly to customers, and it was this law preventing Tesla from establishing a presence in the state. The sale and service center is inside a defunct casino on tribal lands north of Santa Fe, where state law does not apply. The facility opened last week, and tribal leaders and state lawmakers in attendance praised the deal. And those are the headlines for Indian Country Today. I'm Patty Thalahungva. Coming up, we'll take a closer look at the Native presence at both the Emmys and the Met Gala.
But first, we'll meet a Winnebago woman who is now in charge of the Nature Conservancy in Montana. Amy Croover has stepped into her new role as State Director of the Nature Conservancy in Montana. Amy is from the Winnebago tribe of Nebraska and is here to tell us about a 132-acre land transfer. Welcome, Amy.
Hinikaragi, Sisa Praja, Miss Miso Kiaki, Ga Hingarigna, Mahete, Raja, Amy Croover, Ga Hingarigna. Greetings. My name is Longtime Prairie Woman, and my English name is Amy Croover, and it's a pleasure to be here with you today.
So let's start with the story of the land transfer and maybe explain to our viewers why it's so important.
It's an incredible, inspiring thing that I'm so grateful that I was able to be a part of. The story is very long. The initial purchase of the land that's located just off of the Flathead Lake on the Flathead Indian Reservation in Northwest Montana. It was purchased in 1989. And at the time, the Nature Conservancy in Montana was very focused on biodiversity. And since then, we've shifted more towards whole ecosystems. So we have this, 132 acres of land. And, I think from the beginning, there was always a hope that someday we could transfer it back to the tribes, the rightful stewards of this land. And we have a great staff here at TNC Montana, and in earnest started working about 2 years ago when I came on board on the land transfer. It's a big legal process and takes lots of folks, so many hands had a role in making sure that the transfer happens, both on our side as well as with the Confederated Sedition Kootenai tribes. So, it made sense for us for a lot of reasons. When you look at a map, the 132 acres is a perennial wetland marsh, and so it doesn't hold water year-round, but is an incredibly important place for, they had a trumpeter swan reintroduction, the tribes did on this piece of property, as well as it's really important for upland and wetland bird species and many amphibians. And the property is bordered by 3 different sides of tribal land. So now the land will be in contiguous management from the Confederated Sedition Kootenai tribes.
There's a couple things that I'm interested in hearing your take on. And One of them is the modern environmental movement has really not been very inclusive. And your role in the state and this action itself is changing that paradigm.
Yeah, so the Nature Conservancy was started in the 50s, and we have many amazing Indigenous leaders throughout the Conservancy, a state director in Hawaii, and many other programs like Mongolia have Indigenous women leaders. But I am the first and the only Native American woman to be a state director on Turtle Island, so the lower 48. And that certainly says something, right? That it took this long for a Native to assume this position. And I take that with a lot of humility and a lot of responsibility. I feel like it's a great privilege to work at the Nature Conservancy. We're the largest environmental conservation organization on the planet. And so we have a lot of influence when it comes to doing conservation work, stewardship, policy, and really building collaborative partnerships to get conservation work done. And when you look at what Indigenous people mean to the planet, we're about 6% of the population. We have, management of over about 22% of the lands and about 80% of the biodiversity on the planet. And so the Nature Conservancy has adopted a new strategy in the last couple of years to really work with Indigenous people and local communities, because we understand that in order to save the planet, we need to work with Indigenous people who have been stewarding their lands from time immemorial and learn from them, humble ourselves, and let them lead. And so it's a great honor to be in this position and to do this work.
When you think of the complexity of some of the challenges we face now, particularly with climate change, but other environmental issues, Indigenous knowledge seems to be really essential to getting it right. How is that coming into the conversation?
Yeah, I always tell people I'm a really good Indian since I've grown up in Indian country my whole life, but I'm still just a baby ho-chunk. I'm currently learning my language, and just learning my language has taught me a lot about the different perspectives that Indigenous people have versus the English language, and teaches us also something about our relationship to land. There's a story that I heard from one of my aunties that my great-grandfather's Indian name was Ma-e-ma-ni, and Ma stands for earth. And when you translate it into English, it actually represents a tornado, which is conjures up a lot of destruction. But in our language, it actually means dirt walking on earth. And so it is a symbol of the relationship that the land has with the air and everything around itself. And so I think when I think about, how traditional ecological knowledge or Indigenous ways of knowing are coming into the conversation, it's from so many different perspectives. It's listening to Indigenous people about their stories of how their lands have been stewarded. It's trying to understand language. There's so many different place names here in Montana. We have places that are called have camas, and it might not have any camas there today, but because of that Indigenous place name, we know that there was camas at some of these locations. And so it helps us better understand what we should be restoring those lands to. And a lot of that is coming from Indigenous knowledge. But I would say it's most important that we allow it to come from them. And so these are deep partnerships that we have built with both the Blackfeet Nation and the Confederated Sedition Kootenai tribes here in Montana, to learn from them, to partner with them, and to better understand how we can help be allies in stewarding their lands.
How are tribal communities and tribal leaders reacting to this initiative?
I met with the tribal council from the Confederated Sedition Kootenai tribe to get the authority to speak about the rematriation. And it was a great homecoming of a certain aspect because I went to school on that reservation. So I have a degree of environmental science from Salish Kootenai College. And one of the current council members was actually one of my former teachers who taught federal Indian law. And, I think it's always a calculated conversation that tribes have about how vocal to be about these land transactions, because sometimes they can be of a great cultural importance that tribes don't want people to know about it or to talk about it. And during the council meeting, it was a resounding, quote unquote, they wanted me to shout it from the mountaintops. This has been a priority of the tribes from the Flat Reservation to regain their lands. Of course, we know what colonization, what the Homesteading Act did to many reservations is it broke up their landmass. So it's been a priority of theirs to, ensure that they can have autonomy over their own lands. And so folks are pretty excited about it. I do believe it was the first rematriation of a gift to the Confederation Kootenai tribes. And from the TNC perspective, I also believe it was a first because we transferred it unencumbered, so it doesn't have a conservation easement on it, and it will be solely managed under the tribe's resolution and their current management plans that they have to really steward their own lands. And, I'm not sure what other tribal leaders are saying about it, but I do know, and I do hope that this inspires other conservation organizations to do the same, to work with tribes, and when it makes sense, to rematriate those lands back to the rightful stewards.
Well, in fact, it doesn't take long to go into the internet to see hashtag land back. So it makes you wonder if this is a model for beyond even Nature Conservancy and other groups, even in the private sector, to look for ways to return land and to work in partnership.
I really hope so. And, what I was taught by my elders is, we think about land back. It can certainly be about physically regaining our land, but spiritually, it's more about having our cultural connections to land. And so even if organizations are not in a position to transfer land back to tribes, I would really encourage them to build these partnerships and find ways to really help tribes advance self-determination and sovereignty over the lands that they have within their reservation and within their Aboriginal homelands, to ensure that we can restore those cultural connections.
You've had a great history in Montana, and one of the things that strikes me is the role of Montana tribes in the public discourse is different than other states.
Yeah, so I moved to Montana when I was 18, and I've been involved in Indian country here for quite a long time. And, we have tremendous leadership that comes from our tribes here. And it's been humbling for me to learn from that leadership model. So I've personally benefited from it, and I'm always in awe of the amount of influence our tribes here in Montana have over larger conversations that happen within Indian country.
Amy Croover, thank you so much.
Thank you, Mark.
And we'll be right back. Fashion and Hollywood events recently have turned the spotlight on Native people walking the red carpet. ICT's managing editor, Jourdan Bennett-Begaye, joins us now to give us a breakdown of the events. Welcome, Jourdan.
Hi, Mark. Thanks for having me.
Let's start with the Met Gala and a young lady who really turned some heads.
So leading up to the Met Gala was New York Fashion Week, which was actually postponed this year due to the pandemic, of course. Quanah Chasing Horse is a 19-year-old Indigenous model who was modeling at various shows at New York Fashion Week, and it kind of, snowballed into the big Met Gala that happens every year. In the Met Gala, for who people don't know, it's the Super Bowl of fashion, right? You have all of the big designers just who are wanting to, not only make money, but also show off their work. So Quanah Chasing Horse was actually chosen by Peter Dundas to wear his beautiful jewelry. And she, not only was she, it was a big statement because she's, an Indigenous model, but she was also wearing just tons of Diné jewelry. I don't know if you saw it, there's like layers and layers of it, and she has traditional tattoos on, and everyone's saying she looks like a queen and a goddess. And it was just a really, big moment for Indian country, again, just because of the representation at such a huge event that you see, in mainstream news, all over social media. So she really definitely turned heads. You also had Vogue writers, Christian Allaire, who's Ojibwe, who did a profile on her the week before and also after, as well as us. At the Met Gala, also, there is an Indigenous designer whose work is actually displayed in the gala as well. And, I think the big thing too about this event was the theme was focused on American fashion or American independence. And, the just people, a lot of us just don't think that a lot of people don't want to celebrate independence. And that's what Chasing Horse said. But for her to kind of push against the grain made a huge statement for everyone.
Well, and I want to just mention Fashion Week because we all know about designers in virtually every community that do some really amazing stuff. And now the world is catching notice of this. And some of these designers are starting to pop up in lots of different spheres.
Oh, no, that's definitely right. I mean, it's just amazing to see. I mean, I've been a fan of like the fashion since, I don't know, the past several years, and just seeing the Bethany Yellowtail, her and her line just growing, expanding. You see all these, individual artists that come from our community who are getting noticed. And now even, non-native designers are noticing the talent that's there and the talent that we always known that was there too. And it's not the cliche art or designs. It's, and Native people who are extremely talented and who are wanting, to put the representation out there in every way they can, and also collaborate with other artists too. I think that's the big shift that I'm noticing in today with fashion.
Well, shifting from the New York Fashion Center to Hollywood, another big strident representation was at the Emmys last night.
Yeah, it was. So you had the Reservation Dogs co-creator Sterling Harjo, and with the four main actors who were presenting at the 73rd Emmy Awards. It was a sight to see. I won't lie, I cried. It's funny because for about 10 years, I was in college and just on Facebook, I would just blog about different award shows. It'd be the Grammys, the VMAs, the Emmys. And, there's hardly any representation, but to actually see it there in front of us and for the world to see, and it was remarkable. And of course, Indigenous people just blew up social media and were just such in awe that something could happen. And of course, a lot of them said, well, next year, they better be winning an award and not presenting one.
Speaking of Reservation Dogs, you have a story coming out that I want to talk about. And it's a part of the story that really hasn't been told before.
Yes. So I wrote a profile about Mato Waiuhi. He's a 23-year-old Oglala Lakota artist, and he actually scored the music for Reservation Dogs. So meaning he created the original music for the show. I've been a huge fan of score soundtracks pretty much my whole life. It's what I did my homework to in college. It's sometimes how I write. And I think it's just a very, underrated job and just not a job that people pay attention to, but it's also a very non-traditional job for Mato too. I think it was just really remarkable what he did, and he did it in such a non-traditional way, which is very much like the show himself. And the kicker for me was he doesn't know how to read music, which I was just like, wow, that's incredible. But you know, a lot of the great musicians don't know how to read music. You have Jimi Hendrix, Michael Jackson, Paul McCartney. They just don't know how to, but they, you know, they have an ear for it and they have a talent for it. And that's very much like what I found out with Mato when I hung out with him during Santa Fe Indian Market weekend. So that story is up right now.
What surprised you the most when you were reporting that story?
That's a really good question. I think the fact that he was so young, honestly, for me, at 23 years old, I think, what was I doing at that time? But just like the generation he comes from, they're so talented and really ambitious and wanting to make a difference in the world and do it in such a positive way. And it's not for themselves, it's for their community. It's for the greater good. And I think that was I was very impressed with that, but also just the fact that he doesn't know how to read music. And I don't know, I was just really just blown away by that, but he does it so well. And to get noticed by Sterling Harjo and for Harjo to back him up in these, what they call sound spa meetings for the music, that's what it's like. And that's what that type of collaboration and that type of, encouragement is definitely what we need in Indian country.
Jourdan Bennett-Begaye, thank you.
Yeah.
And that's a slice of our Indigenous world. Thank you for watching. For all the latest news, go to IndianCountryToday.com. I'm Mark Trahan.
Sometimes you got to take a stand just because you know you can. Oh, you got to run, you got to run. Standing
This is Indian Country Today.